I believe last week we were showing you some new things that most of you didn't know about the Tower of Babel, and especially about this infamous early rebellious patriarchal figure known as Nimrod here in chapters 10 and 11. And we trust that the Lord will be gracious to show us some more things about the same subject this evening. So we'll be back on 10 and 11 again with the Tower of Babel. Probably again on it next week. We'll just have to see what we get done here this evening. So back to chapter 10, you ought to know a little bit more about Nimrod than you did before.
Thank you, Brother. Amen.
We didn't really get to that much of the Tower of Babel last time, but we were looking at its founder and originator. Nimrod, he's important for a variety of reasons, but one of the most obvious and outstanding ones is the amount of space delegated to a description of him and his early works back in chapter 10. Cush begat Nimrod, so he's a Hamite, one of the ones under the curse, by the way. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. And so we were looking at the fact that if we didn't do a little deeper study into Nimrod in the passage, then many of the descriptions of him here in chapter 10, he's not mentioned, of course, by name in chapter 11, but here in chapter 10, would be a little ambiguous because it can be taken either positively or negatively. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. Well, what's wrong with being a mighty one? He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Well, what's wrong with hunting some geese and quail and whatever they have over there? Because back in chapter 9, verse 3, they are for the first time given the privilege of partaking of meat in their diet. But that's really not what the word hunter means here. Oh, it can refer to that. Maybe he shot a goose every now and then with the bow and arrow. But that's not what he's talking about, because what does hunting geese have to do with building the Tower of Babel? It'd be totally out of context here. If he was a good rabbit hunter, then why is he going to go into chapter verses 10, 11, and 12 and talk about all these great cities he's builded? In other words, his hunting must have something to do with his occupation of being a builder, a tyrannical one at that. So the only conclusion we can draw is that he was a hunter of men, because you can't build a kingdom and be a king over it unless you have subjects. And you can't get to the place of being a king with a kingdom without a group of rebellious political aides that will help you attain whatever goal it is that you are aspiring for. So the reference in verse 9 to Nimrod being this mighty hunter must be in light of the fact that he's going to need men to help him accomplish what he wants to do. One man can't build a whole city and build a whole kingdom, and certainly can't build this city in verse 4 of chapter 11, and the tower in verse 4 of chapter 11. And besides that, right in the next verse, verse 10 of chapter 10, he goes right on to say that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And then it mentions the other cities and things that he built and had something to do with. But since it's going right into the fact that he was known not for his hunting animals, but for his building a kingdom, then we're going to have to tie verse 9 into verses 10, 11, and 12. And the only way to do that is to get men out of his subject of hunting rather than what you would commonly think of, and that would be animals. Therefore, rather than being a hunter before the Lord, he's a hunter against the Lord. Or, as we said, in opposition to the Lord, to such an extent that a popular saying went around, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter against the Lord, or in opposition to the Lord. So we kind of wrap up a little bit here in chapter 10 in case you weren't following last week. and you are thinking that it was still somehow talking about animals, then explain to us how is that going to fit in with the building of a city and a tower in chapter 11. Now, although the building of the tower and the city in chapter 11 is not designated in that chapter to Nimrod by name, in verse 9 of chapter 11, it mentions the name of the place as being Babel. And since he's the one who had the beginning of his kingdom in 1010 in Babel, must be the same Babel. And it must be the same work transpiring in verse 10 of chapter 10, where he's beginning a kingdom in Babel. That was the name of the city, not of the tower. We'll get to that later. And then verse 8 and verse 9 of chapter 11, where they were not able to complete the city. You see, all it said back in chapter 10 is the beginning of his kingdom, not the end of it. He went on to go up into Assyria. Why? Because of verse 8 of chapter 11, and they left off to build a city. Someone else had to come along and complete it later on, as we know of Great Babylon. But then in verse 9, therefore is the name of it called Babel. So the Babel of 11 is the same Babel as back in chapter 10. Verse 10 of 10, it's in the land of Shinar. Then out of that land not went forth Ashur, but went forth Nimrod unto Ashur, another name for Assyria, and builded this series of cities, the first one being Nineveh, and the last designation in verse 12 happens to refer not back to Rezin or to Caleb, but all the way back to Nineveh, the same as a great city. None of the other cities could fit the designation of being a great city besides Nineveh. So all we really had looked at were the first two verses of chapter 11, which we can call the introduction to the chapter. Introduction in general, with verse 1 being the specific introduction, and then verse 2 giving us their transportational background that we need to know to find out who all the plural pronouns they and us are referring to. When it says that it came to pass as they journeyed toward the east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there, it can only be referring to all the people that chapters 9 and 10 have been talking about, and those are the descendants of Noah, the ones that would be alive and living in the Ararat region at the time. So we come now to verses 3 and 4. Now verses 3 and 4 give us the actual building. Then I'll just give you a quick little outline here of where we'll be headed. Then verses 5 through 7, God's reaction to their building project, which is not favorable. And then verses 8 and 9, the result of God's reaction to their rebellious building project. So we've already looked at verses 1 and 2, introduction. Then verses 3 and 4, the building. That's what we come to now. And in verse 3, we have their stated purpose of providing materials. So we have the preparation for their materials. You see, if all we had in chapter 11 were the first 3 verses, we wouldn't know what in the world they were doing. You realize that? It never starts off saying what they're going to do. It starts off setting the scene by telling us that the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And then it tells us how they journeyed and came to this plain in the land of Shinar and dwelt there. And then in verse 3, it tells us that they began to make bricks and slime for their mortar, but it doesn't tell us what they were going to do with that. We don't get to that until verse 4, and then verse 5 goes on to begin what God's reaction is. So let's begin back up in verse 3. Now here in the King James Version, we have that peculiar, mysterious little phrase, 3 times as a matter of fact, verse 3, 4, and 7, go to, go to, go to. It's an old King James saying that, well, we would say just the opposite today. We'd say, come here, come here, come here. But in Elizabethan England, what you would say is go to if you wanted to do something. But go to, how could you say go to and let us make brick and burn them thoroughly? If you said go and everyone left, how could you build the bricks then? So it's an antiquated phrase. It's all right to leave it there because it's so peculiarly cute in the King James Version. But for us today, it means just the opposite of that. Come here. You don't say go to and help me do this because they'd take off then. You'd say, come here, and let's do that. So we'll read it that way. Come here, and let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. It was the process, if you'll turn over to Exodus chapter 5, that we see employed thousands of years later by the children of Israel whenever they're down in Egypt, building the bricks that are needed by the pharaohs for all of their rebellious building projects, such as the great temples and great tombs and great pyramids that are built by the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. You see, they made bricks a little differently than we do today. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. And they said, the God of the Hebrews hath met with us. Let us go, we pray thee, 3 days' journey into the desert, and sacrifice unto the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. The king of Egypt said unto them, wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron, let the people from their works, get you unto your burdens. And Pharaoh said, behold, the people of the land now are many, and ye make them rest from their burdens. And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, ye shall no more give the people straw to make brick as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And if you remember the account here in chapter 5, they end up actually having to go down in verse 12 and look for stubble rather than straw because they couldn't even find straw. At one time it was provided for them. But in this alluvial plain of Shinar in Genesis 11, there are no stones that would be adequate for building blocks in any type of construction project that the people would be wanting to do. Instead, they're going to have to make the bricks themselves. Now notice what verse 3 says. Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone. In other words, there are no stones when you've got a nice smooth plain like that, but you've got plenty of good wet mud and clay. And that's just what you're going to be making these bricks out of. You're going to form them into a little rectangular shape and put a little wooden cast or mold around them, put them out in the sun, leave them out there a few days, and let the sun bake them, and they'll turn just as hard as a stone. And slime had they for mortar. What exactly the slime is, we don't know, but you still can get the picture. You've got to somehow fill in all the chinks and cracks in between the bricks, and they had some type of substance that was found locally that once applied in the chinks and cracks between the bricks, it would thereafter dry and become hard and serve for all practical purposes, just like our cement mortar that we have today. So in verse 3, that's their preparation for their materials. Now, what actually are they planning on doing? Well, there are two things that they want to do. Now, from Sunday school, generally the only thing that comes to people's minds when they think of Genesis 11 is the Tower of Babel. But there were two things they were going to build, a city and a tower. They have to have both of these together. It's not just a tower they were going to build. We've been telling you that all along by the fact that back in chapter 10 and verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Well, was that a tower? No. That was a city. Verse 9 of chapter 11, therefore is the name of it, of what? The city, the last word in verse 8, called Babel. Babylon, just an ancient name for Babylon. So they're building two things here. Not just a tower, they're building a city. Now I can state in advance that they complete the tower, the text informs us, but they don't complete the city. Someone comes along later and completes the city for them. And that's told us in verse 8, that they left off to build the city. In other words, they didn't complete their total project of what they had planned to do. Now, verse 8, by the way, happens to be used by some commentators to prove that Nimrod, since Nimrod is not mentioned in chapter 11, could not be the instigator and leader of this group of people and the, so to speak, foreman of this building project, because in chapter 10 it says that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And they assume by that it means that he completely built Babel. But then in chapter 11, whoever this is leading this group of people, and since it is a whole network of people building this project, we have to assume they've got some type of leader over them. But since chapter 11 says that they left off building the city, they didn't complete it, then how could it be Nimrod? Since they say that chapter 10 says that he built Babel. Well, chapter 10 doesn't say that. It leaves us hanging in doubt by simply saying that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And since it goes on to say that he left there afterwards and went into Assyria, that fits right into chapter 11, since they never got through with Babel. So very evidently he must have been the one, although he's not mentioned in chapter 11. Why mention him? He's covered in 5 verses back in chapter 10. But he must have been the one who's leading this group of people to build this city and to build this tower, although they don't complete the city. That's not too important. That was the beginning of his kingdom, but someone else would come along and finish that for him later on. The important thing is the tower that they are building. They said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower." So here are the 2 things that they are planning on doing. Now I want to give you a couple of purposes behind their building endeavor here. So we see right away what they're planning on doing. They're wanting to build a city and build a tower. Well, why? I mean, people are building cities and towers throughout the whole Old Testament. One thing you had to have with all cities in the Old Testament was a tower, and it was called the watchtower. You had to have a watchtower with a watchman on the watchtower to watch out for your enemies. And so all cities in the Old Testament, as well as in the New Testament, had towers along with them. It comes from an old Canaanite word, migdal, that's seen in various compound connections in the Old Testament. That refers to a tower, but the tower here is a little bit different. Now, it's argued, since that really is the base of the word that's being used here in 11:4, that that's all this tower represents and symbolizes here, is the fact that they are simply building your regular, standard, run-of-the-mill city, and it's accepted that all cities of that time have towers to go along with them. Then why does all Christians want to make a big thing about the Tower of Babel? I mean, we've all heard of the Tower of Babel. And if it's just really a watchtower, then what's so significant about it? Nothing. That's the point. Nothing would be significant. Why give us 9 verses in chapter 11 about someone building a city with a standard watchtower? Unless the tower is not a standard watchtower. The tower is an entirely, completely different type of tower, different purpose, different significance attached to the tower, its construction, its building, and so forth. So let me give you a couple of purposes behind their building. First of all, it's stated in verse 4 of chapter 11 that they wanted to gain recognition by making a name for themselves. That's right in the middle of verse 4. Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, and let us make us a name. Now, from all we know, they're the only people around today, and they've all traveled from the Ararat region down to the plain of Shinar to begin building this. So they are saying, let us make us a name, but there's no one else around. So who's going to know about the name you've got except you yourself? And you already know that, so why make a name for yourself? In other words, there must be something else behind this. I mean, you're not going to build, if you were the only person on the whole planet, you wouldn't say, I'm going to build a house so I'll get a great name throughout all the earth. Who would know about that great house or fortress or castle that you built? Wouldn't have any purpose at all. If there's no one else around to enjoy it, or no one else around so that you can say, now look what I've done, unless maybe you're pointing more upwards than outwards. Then secondly, right along with that, they are wanting to obtain a center of worldly political power. Obviously, there would be people in the future, so they're wanting to establish a center for worldly political power. Politics and religion, according to the New Testament, don't mix. Amen. But according to the Christian world out there today and their foundation they had with Nimrod, they do indeed mix. And it's found all the way back this early. Nimrod is a political leader. He's a tyrant. But he's also a religious leader. As we said last week, he's going to be establishing a new, universal, not heard of heretofore religion. And he ties that in with his establishment of a political kingdom, here with his city and with his tower. So that again is but one of many reasons why we don't feel that politics and religion should be mixed. Yeah. It has its origin with the rebellious Nimrod, because he has his political setup here as well as, you see, he's got all these people that he has hunted down, chapter 10, verse 9, that he has hunted down and lorded over to get done what he wants to do. And of course what he wants to bring about eventually is this new religion that we don't have any hint of in chapter 10, but we do have in chapter 11. And that's why I ended last week by saying that Nimrod is probably our best biblical type of the Antichrist, because he's going to build a religious empire upon a political empire. You start with your politics first and get everyone united in politics, and then you can go off. You see, if everyone's united in politics, doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or a communist or whatever you want to be, as long as you can get all united in your political ideology, then you just introduce religion to that and you'll all be united in that as well. And it began back here with Nimrod, and it's going to be culminated in the ministry of the Antichrist, where he's going to be setting up a political kingdom and then a religious empire on top of that. As a matter of fact, the book of Daniel shows that he'll even sweep right into his kingdom, at least for a short period of time, the whole nation of Israel. That's right, because in Daniel chapter 9, we read that after half of the week, they're going to break their covenant that they had with Antichrist when they realize who he really is. And so for at least a short period of time, they're going to have been swept right into this, what we see, Baptists, Catholics, Methodists, even now the Charismatics, of mixing politics and religion together. Now in the Old Testament, you see, people will say, what about Old Testament? Old Testament's Old Testament. God dealt with a nation of people there. And so when you deal with a nation, obviously you've got politics. You've got to have a leader of that nation and so forth. And the religion was mixed right in with the politics. But not in the New Testament, though. Why? He's no longer dealing with one particular nation, so he can have his regenerate king or whoever is going to be the leader of that nation and all the leaders under them, and they're supposed to offer sacrifices and so forth. And under the Old Testament, that was the one problem they had, where the kings of Israel and Judah were always trying to separate themselves and their political kingdom from the true religion of Israel and the worship of Yahweh. Now, they would mix it with a false religion, but not the true religion. And charismatics today can hardly wait to get to their senator's or congressman's door to pound on it and let him have a piece of their mind about prayer in public schools or what their kiddies are learning. They can hardly wait to get there. Well, so you've got another thing to keep in mind if you ever are tempted to be sucked into that false teaching, that started with Nimrod. Politics and religion being mixed together. Very obviously. All right, then a third purpose behind the foundation of the city and the tower, and this is really evident from chapter 9 and 11, is that they are defying God in His command in chapter 9 to fill up the earth. You see, if you'll turn back to chapter 9, verse 1, God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. All right, then over in chapter 11 and verse 4, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, and let us make us a name, lest we do what God told us to do back in chapter 9. Lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Don't like moving from one place to another. Want to get good and secure right where they are, build their little city, build their little kingdom. And what Christian do you know today who doesn't fit into the same category? They are looking for that little acre on the lake where they can retire and live there, they think, forever and ever. And God tells them to, like Abraham, pack up and move, and I'll take you to a land of promise that I'll give to you. There's no way they'll do that. Well, it ties into other things that... well, you see, they don't want to be scattered. They like the security of home there. And I'm telling you, there are Christians everywhere that will never be used of God, because they like the security of their grassroots region that they've been born and brought up in. And you get them away from that, and they don't like that at all. Scattered abroad on the face of the whole earth, how are we going to make it? Well, Nimrod didn't want to do that. Neither did anyone else. But that was the command back in chapter 9. Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. So they are trying in direct contradiction of what God's commandment is to isolate themselves in one location and just keep themselves there and not go and do what He's told them to do. So that's a third purpose for their building the city and the tower. There are towers and cities being built. I'm thinking of one charismatic university. They have something there they call a city and something they call a tower. Isn't that interesting? You would think people who claim to be Christians had read the Bible. Because if I built a city and a tower, I'd name them something else besides that. I wouldn't call something the city of or the something tower when that's right in chapter 11 in Nimrod. Call it the fortification or something. Or the tree house that you built. But don't call it a city and a tower. I guess you know what I have reference to here. And it seems like there are a lot of other ministries that like to build big spiral buildings and towers and cities and retirement homes and so forth. You would think people had read the Bible. I mean, I'm being honest. I wonder if they've ever read the Bible. To build these little getaway retirement places, you know, the old people's retirement place, and then have a lot of amusements there, and you think that if they'd ever read Genesis 11, of course they'd say, well, that's Nimrod, or they wouldn't even know it's Nimrod. They'd just say, that's back then. The church always wanting to say either everything's back then or everything's for out there. Tongues and healing were for back there. And, you know, any type of confidence or assurance in your heart, that's for over there. You know, you can't be confident of anything today. You can't know that you're saved. I mean, that'd be presumptuous to say, I know that I'm saved and I have eternal life. No, they're wanting to put it for over there. That's why they sing all those songs, over Jordan's stormy banks. You know, as soon as we get over there, everything will be for us over there. If it's not over there, it was for back then. And that always gets me a little aggravated that I was born out of due time then. I should have been born back then or out in the future sometime. Hallelujah. But the Word says Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What was available back then, I'm talking about the apostolic age, is still available for us today. So the church likes to say back then, and if they ever read Genesis 11, they'd say that's back then. And what we're doing now doesn't have anything to do with what was done back then. But the name of the place tells us just the contrary. The name is Babel, which means confusion. And in all religious establishments, that's all you have. From a corner to the other is confusion. So to say back then really doesn't work because the definition of the title of the city fits most churches and religious institutions today. So anyway, to get beyond the city and the tower, let's go on to a fourth purpose, and that's the interesting one. That is their purpose of establishing a new universal religion. For the a fourth purpose, and that's the interesting one. That is their purpose of establishing a new universal religion. Now you probably couldn't even guess, unless maybe you've done some independent study, what religion this was, and even if you had done some study and maybe come up with what religion it is, you won't understand how it is still so applicable to today and to our generation. Nimrod is the founder, and this is very easy to prove, of the first system of organized religion. There's been no system of organized religion prior to this. All the way back to Adam and Eve, you know, they had a personal relationship with God. Back in chapter 4, verse 26, then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Remember, we taught you back then there was this minor period of revival during this time, Genesis 4:26. Still no organized religion, it's a personal religion. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Say, what about chapter 6 and the time of Noah? No, there's not even any form of organized, institutionalized religion then. Because in Luke 17, Jesus said that the days of the coming of the Son of Man would be like the days of Noah, when they were eating and drinking and marrying and given in marriage. And one thing that speaks of is a secular humanistic society that doesn't have any standard organized religion. Now you can't press that too far because the New Testament goes on to say that although our society today, just before the return of the Lord, will be secular and humanistic, it will still be religious through and through. But in Noah's day, there is no form of organized religion. But there is here in Nimrod's day. He's the founder of it. You should have been able to guess that since he's the founder of Babylon. And Babylon throughout Scripture is symbolic of institutionalized, false, rebellious religion in the eyes of God. Without any proof text, you should be able to guess that if there was ever a founder in a time of founding for organized religion, it would have to be Nimrod in Genesis 10 and Genesis 11. But you say, well, where is that in chapter 11? Where, by the way, in chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, is there any hint of religion? All we have is masonry here, building. And then we have a little bit in the area of linguistics because they get their languages changed in the end of the chapter. Where is any hint of religion? Well, we've got only one hint, one word. That's in verse 4, and that's the word heaven. That's the only hint of religion that we have. Now, what's heaven have to do with? Well, heaven always has something to do with religion. Now, if we didn't have this, then we don't have anything in chapter 11, because all it talks about is building a city and building a tower. You're probably wondering out there, how am I going to get around to the religion? But just stay with where I am right now, that if we didn't have this, and how in the world, all they're doing is building a city and a tower. And unless I hadn't already last week and so far this evening pre-programmed your mind to be thinking in the area of religion, you couldn't think of religion. All you think of is masonry, carpentry, linguistics, political empire here. Well, where does religion come in? Well, we got the one word heaven. And heaven has to do with God or gods or goddesses or something. So let's go back and look at verse 4. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower." And as I say, verse 8 says they never completed the city, but no mention is made of the tower not being completed, so we have to assume the tower was completed. They would have probably been working on them contemporaneously, but the tower was the important thing. All you'd have to do in the city is get a place to live in while you built the tower. But the tower's what's important. The city they never did finish. And since it says that of the city, not of the tower must have been more important than the city. But what good is it going to do to have a watchtower and no city to watch? If, as most commentators say, that this Canaanite word here, Migdal, refers to a watchtower. What good is it to have a watchtower, nothing to watch? You'd build a city first and then the watchtower, because the city's the most important thing. The watchtower is only important because it protects the city, which shows that the city's more important than the tower. But since evidently they were putting more energy into the tower than into the city, the tower must have been more important. Whose top, King James says, may reach unto heaven. May reach is in italics and shouldn't be there. We've all gotten the notion, the ridiculous notion from Sunday school, that we have a bunch of imbeciles here who actually thought they could build a tower high enough to reach God. Isn't that what you think of when you think of the Tower of Babel? That's never even hinted at in the text, except our little italics that are added in here for us. That we think that they are building a tower, and of course any fool would never think of doing something like that. How are you going to reach God? And I can remember any lesson I ever had from Sunday school, that's what it was. They were trying to build a tower and get all the way up to God. Amen. That's not what the text says, though. I'll read what it literally says. "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top is heaven." Literally, it's what it says, whose top is heaven. They weren't going to try to make one and hope that it reached to heaven. They were going to make one knowing that they were going to get right to where they wanted to go, and that was heaven, and the top of their tower was going to be heaven as far as they were concerned. Now that throws a little different light on the subject. "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top is heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The particular religion that Nimrod founded is known today and was known at that time as astrology. The tower that's mentioned here has been seen, at least in representative form, in at least 30 locations in ancient Babylonia by means of temple towers known as ziggurats. Z-I-G-G-U-R-A-T-S. Ziggurat. It's an Assyrian Babylonian name. And it has nothing to do with the Canaanite Migdal term that refers to a city watchtower. This word refers to a temple tower. And There are about 30 of these. They're not found anywhere else in the world except in Babylon. And they're known in ancient inscriptions as ziggurats. And that word means temple tower. Now, with that in mind, we even have a clear reference to religion since it says temple tower. We know that all temples have to do something with religion. And there are about 30 of them there. There's one about 10 miles south of where the remains of the ancient city of Babel is today that many people believe happens to be the very one that is referred to here. It could well be. But there are 30 that are in the general area. And they're all known as ziggurats. They're all built the same way. Let me describe quickly how they're built. They are similar to a pyramid in shape, but what you have is it's a rectangular building. It's very near a square, by the way, so don't think of a long rectangle like this pulpit. It's very close to being a square. But you have a small rectangular block built upon a large rectangular block. Let's say the bottom block, the base of it might be, say, 400 feet around, and maybe it's 20 feet high. And so then on top of that, you build another block that's 20 feet high that's only 300 feet around the base. In other words, you're going to be going up in a pyramid fashion, but not like the pyramids with a slope. You can go up, and then you've got a ledge to walk all the way around on. And then you can climb another group of steps and get up to the second level. They have 7 levels on them, by the way. And that's got a ledge. And then you've got a smaller square built on top of that, like cubes, but the cubes are smaller, each one than the other, until you get to the very top where you have a religious shrine that is built. Now, the ones that have been discovered are painted 7 different colors, representing at that time what they would refer to as the 7 known planets. If I remember correctly, 2 of them really wouldn't be planets because they included the sun and the moon, along with Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. If I remember correctly, that should be 5 planets. The sun and the moon, 2 more, gives us 7, we'll call them planets, heavenly bodies, and therefore 7 different layers painted 7 different colors. Now, let's take, for example, Mars would be painted obviously red because that's the color of Mars as you view it here on the Earth. Sometimes it's a blood red color. And so like Jupiter would be, I think, a burnt orange type of color. I forget all the other colors, but they would each have a certain color associated with one of these heavenly bodies that would also be associated with one of the rectangular blocks that had been built, the one up on top of the other. Now, this would be a very huge structure, like many, many hundreds of feet tall. And you could have a stairway that led from the court up to the second level, and then to get to every level higher than that, there was a stairway on each level that would go up to the next level. Now, why the different colors? Because they represent the different planets. Why represent the different planets? Because your religion is astrology. And the chief thing in astrology happens to be the planets. And of course, the sun and the moon are important as well, because there are sun goddesses and gods and moon goddesses and gods, as well as those gods and goddesses that happen to be attached to the other planets, 5 planets that they would have included at that time that we know today to be actually that, planets, and not something like a star, which our sun is. So what they've got here in verse 4, whose top is heaven, at the very top of this, they would have a religious shrine where they would have the signs of the zodiac printed. Now, the worship of the stars and the planets is very, very ancient. As a matter of fact, it's as ancient as what we're saying right now is Nimrod. That's how ancient it is. It is the first institutionalized, organized system of religion, astrology. As a matter of fact, some people actually believe that the devil, although there's no way to prove this, it certainly makes a lot of sense that the devil made a personal appearance to Nimrod as he worshipped in this shrine and gave him quite a bit of revelation about occult knowledge that was spread down through the astrological religions that have emanated from Nimrod and his first religion that he established. Now, there's no reason not to believe that, because how did man get all of these ideas about snakes and bears and lions and Capricorn and Cancer and everything in the heavenly bodies? Unless a demon or the devil himself, by deception of course, reveal these things. I mean, what you might see as a lion, someone else might see as a tiger. I'm talking about the setup of the stars. And if we're going to worship the stars, how about the clouds? They give us more pictures than the stars do every day. If they're around, well, you can get all types of pictures out of the clouds. But it's the devil who, by some method, and perhaps by a direct appearance here, while Nimrod is worshiping in his religious shrine, gave this secret occult knowledge to him that's been passed down ever since that time. And you say, well, what's astrology have to do? I've never been involved in astrology. How can we see that this is really the beginning of institutionalized religion? Well, let me give you several things behind that. In the first place, if you keep up with what's going on in the world today, here in these last days in which we live, there's been a tremendous increase and rise in interest in astrology like never before. And I'm talking about educated people now. There are literally hundreds of columns in daily and weekly newspapers in this country that carry people's horoscopes in them. And of course, the horoscope is based directly upon astrological worship. And it's carried by hundreds of magazines and newspapers, not only in this country, but all over the world. And a lot of the other branches that one can find in the occult somehow are traceable back to astrology, as you'll see as we go along. So, it certainly does tie into the age in which we live, since astrology is in vogue today. Now, you might not have actually been in that form of astrology, but let's go on. Secondly, what would you have to say? We've mentioned this before in creation, about the United States space program. If that's not a worship of outer space, I don't know what is. You see, what we're going to be covering here to show how it ties into organized religion today doesn't necessarily mean that you actually read your horoscope every day. That's not astrology. That's just part of astrology. Astrology is a religion based on the heavenly bodies. Now, you can have a whole bunch of different branches of that. Now, if you want to get real technical, we could give you a technical definition, but just in general, astrology is a religion that's based on the heavenly bodies. Well, what do you call NASA and the space program in this country if it's not a worship of the heavenly bodies? When on the contrary, God said in Psalm 115 and verse 16, the heaven, even the heavens, are the Lord's, but the earth hath he given to the children of men. Psalm 115, 16. Amen. And we are pumping not millions, billions of dollars into the space program. Why? To go worship different planets, different things that we shouldn't be out there exploring in the first place, out there in that vast, vast universe of ours. Oh, there's nothing wrong with laying on your back at night, midnight, and you're wanting to look at the stars. That's what David did, Psalm 8. Amen. But it's a different thing to get involved in some emanation of astrological worship. And that's just part of it. Why is our country so interested in sending out all of these rockets and all of these little probers that want to take pictures of everything? Who cares what Pluto looks like? You'll never visit the planet. It's several hundred degrees below zero. What would you want to do there? It's cold enough for most of you around here. And so I don't know why people always are wanting to go out there and explore these things that you're never going to visit. You'll never live there. Amen. Say, well, we might live on the moon. All right, let's just study the moon then. That doesn't satisfy them. The moon, that's peanuts. We can hop, skip, and jump to the moon now. Give us something else, like someone traveled to the very center of the sun. Something that's really difficult to do. And that'll get their interest all stirred up then. Or go out there to those rings around Saturn and like someone's going to live there. That planet's made of nothing but gases. If you stood on it, you'd fall through it to the other side. So why be interested about Saturn? Or Jupiter? I mean, Jupiter with its great red spot and all the storms that rage on the planet Jupiter, you've never seen anything until you've seen a storm on Jupiter. Our little hurricanes and tornadoes are nothing. Toothpicks, straws, matchsticks compared to the storms you'll see on the planet Jupiter. And you certainly wouldn't want to get on something like Mercury that's nothing but molten lead for all practical purposes. So the point is, it's nothing but a worship of these things to be spending so much money that's wasted for no purpose at all. Now, let's just put everything aside in the Bible for a moment and say, all right, I can understand the moon. You know, it's so close. Maybe we could live there. So we'll just give them the benefit of the doubt on the moon. Maybe Mars. You know, they're always looking on Mars for dry riverbeds there. And they're saying, see, there are dry riverbeds there. Well, the point is, they're dry. If they're that, they're dry. They think they made a discovery because there used to be water there. But the point is, if there's no water there now, what good does that do us that there used to be water there? So that rules out Mars. The only hope we have is the moon, and it's not a planet. So why are they wasting all of our money and time and all the print and all the advertisement and all the publicity they get for going around and exploring things that we have nothing to do with and that have nothing to do with us at all? Unless this isn't simply one of those emanations of astrological worship. And then thirdly, one you may not have thought of, but this is an interesting one, and that is the contemporary church's belief, practical belief, it's their belief in practice, of an impotent God. They say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, the church of our day doesn't believe God can do anything, except maybe, possibly, if you're lucky, he might can save your soul. But for all practical purposes, he can't do anything else besides that. Therefore, for all practical purposes, he is an impotent God. And they show this in their life by being so caught up with time that when you come along preaching, and this is why, by the way, we preach so much on Mark 11:24, that when you pray, believe that you receive, and you shall have it, because all time is the turning of the earth in relation to the sun. But you see, most Christians out there, when you come presenting them with any type of message beyond salvation of the soul, and they think, you mean I'm going to have to hurt for 6 hours, 6 weeks, 6 months before I get my healing? What they're saying is, I'm going to have to wait for the earth to turn around in relation to the sun. Everything that they do is based upon the fact they're always telling you, just pray for me, brother, that I'll hold on to the end. You know, that I'll hold on as long as the earth keeps spinning and keeps going around the sun. In other words, everything they do is based upon the heavenly bodies. You tell them that God answers prayer now. When you pray, believe that you receive. Oh, no, they can't believe that. They are so caught up in time. And time, just by definition, is totally wrapped up in the heavenly bodies. And besides that, the same thing, the belief in the impotent God, which is what our church's doctrine today is, it's manifested in astrology as such, because what in the world can astrology do for you? What can those vast planets out there ever really do for you in your life? And most Christians view God about the same as people who worship cut and dried astrology worship the planets. God's so far out there, he can't do anything. Oh, he can save a soul if you're lucky and he's not busy. But they tie his hands up with so much doubt and unbelief, you just as soon worship Jupiter or Saturn. They can't do anything for you, and neither can God. They've forgotten that the Scriptures say, Psalm 46 in verse 1, that our God is a refuge and strength, a present help in time of trouble.
Hallelujah.
To them he's so distant and so far out in outer space, the man with the long white beard on a throne. that he couldn't possibly help them on time. You see, they're always caught up in time. Do you believe God, could actually help you? Well, maybe he could help me somehow, but I've got to have the money by next month. In other words, I've got to have it before the earth turns around 30 times. They're always caught up in the heavenly bodies. If the earth turns around 30 times, it'll be too late then. And they don't realize the Bible says how many times the earth turns has nothing to do with the fact that when you pray, believe that you have received.
Amen.
If he lets it turn 30 times, if you're worried about that, you're back to astrology. Maybe you've never thought of it like that. I doubt anyone has, because I've never heard it from anyone. You're back to astrology if you're worried about how many times the earth turns and how far it goes around the sun, and where the Big Dipper is in the various hemispheres that we have, and what constellations you can see at what time of year. If you're worried about all those things in relation to the prayer that you have prayed in the past. You're saying, my life is guided by the heavenly bodies then. And if the heavenly bodies do too much, keep turning and moving and so forth, then I'll die of this disease before I get my healing. Or I'll go bankrupt before I get my money. You see what I'm saying here?
Amen.
They're saying my life is tied up in the heavenly bodies. And that's why, dear friends, we come emphasizing Mark 11:24, Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Mark 11:24, therefore I say unto you, when you pray, believe that you have received, and ye shall have it. Because if you don't, you're showing to yourself and to those of us that are knowledgeable that you're caught up in the heavenly bodies. How do you like that? We might call you an old astrology worshiper. If we find you complaining that the earth has turned a quarter of a turn, we call that 6 hours, and your body still has pain in it. We might call you an old pagan astrology worshiper then. And most Christians are. They want everything now, now, now. And if the heavenly bodies move any, then, that just wrecks their whole life. Now, they don't think of it like that. But that's in the final result. What they're saying is my life is guided by the heavenly bodies. Okay, and a fourth area where we see the same thing being manifested today is in the Catholic Church, where the Catholics worship heavenly bodies. Now, they call them saints, angels, different names. They don't call them Pluto, but they'll put another name to it, like Saint Thomas or Saint Jude or Saint James. And, of course, bless the dear Catholics' hearts, they could hardly wait until the ink dried on John's last period in Revelation to start dreaming up new extra-canonical saints. And I don't know how many there are. I doubt anyone knows. They're always canonizing someone. Someone dug up from the 1300s that was an adulterer, a fornicator, a horse thief, but was charitable, gave away a lot of money. And so they canonized the blasphemous soul. So they've got a whole intricate network and system of heavenly bodies. Saints, angels, a whole bunch of angels. I know about those angels that you can't find a verse in the Bible. Where did they get all the names to all these angels? Well, some of them out of the Apocrypha. The other ones they just dreamed up. Just like you can invent a name and call him Bob the Angel, or Mac or something. And they just dream up these names. And then they'll pray to these, heavenly bodies. And they'll bow before the heavenly saints and hope that maybe they'll get enough merits from one of the saints to knock off a millennium of purgatory. And do some Hail Marys to knock off a couple of decades that you'd otherwise have to spend down there in purgatory. Well, I don't know if you're laughing because you don't know about Catholics or because you do know about Catholics. But if you don't, that's the whole system there. You've got to you don't have any merits. You got to get some merits from all the saints. You see, that's their doctrine, that the saints have enough merit stored up, they can supply the whole world. But you got to do the right thing to get them. Crawl up St. Peter's on your knees or something, or have the Pope bless you, and that'll give you some of someone else's merits. That'll knock a few years off purgatory. because no one actually goes to heaven or hell. Everyone goes to purgatory. And either you stay there forever and ever, which is the same as hell if you're going to stay there and suffer, or you stay there long enough to get your soul cleansed. Maybe someone will pray for you while you're in purgatory and do some good deeds and some good works for you while you're there and try to get you out. So the Catholics are worshiping heavenly bodies. And then fifthly, we see today throughout organized religion what Paul warns against in Galatians 4, the worship of days and months and times and years.
Amen.
How about Christmas, Easter, Yuletide, Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's, birthday of Martin Luther, or whatever type of religious holiday you want to find? And Paul says to the Galatians, I am afraid of you, lest I've labored on you all of my work and toil in vain. Why? Because you are still observing days and months and times and years. We're back to astrology. Oh, Christmas time comes around, all the planets are in the right alignment. I mean, they don't think of that, but you see, the only time December 25th can come around is right after December the 24th.
Amen.
And all the planets are the same way they were, and the stars the same way they were last December 25th. Now, they're not like that, you see, in the summer. You've got different arrangement in the skies at different times of the year. So they are astrological worshipers that are always caught up in all of these pagan religious holidays. Days and months and times and years, then they are still caught up in institutionalized, organized religion. Now, I want to give you a couple of ways how we can see that. In particular, Nimrod is the founder of institutionalized religion, whether it's astrology or not. In the first place, the founder's name points towards that. Remember, Nimrod's name means the rebellious one. You just take, we could list easily a half a dozen doctrines from the Word of God to your average Christian and see if they don't fit the name of Nimrod in a hurry. Give them some of the Sermon on the Mount. Don't take your neighbor to court. Turn the other cheek. Not when he hits you on one, smash him on the other. But when he slaps you on one, turn the other. You take them that and find out if everyone in the whole world today, their name is not Nimrod. Everyone's rebelling against God. And then secondly, the name of religious headquarters of that day, which was Babel, which is a Hebrew word that means confusion. And Paul says over in 1 Corinthians 14:33 that God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the assemblies of the saints. And it doesn't matter if it's First Baptist or Last Baptist, the real name of it's Babel, confusion. Or you could say Nimrod. You could say, in other words, that the church's name is Babel and the pastor's name is Nimrod. He's the rebellious one, and he leads his congregation of utter confusion. All right, that's all we've got time to get through on that tonight. We've got more to cover on it next week then.
Thank you.